Hello and welcome to this 30th of April podcast episode for Early Music at Newcastle, a festival all about promoting historically informed performance. This episode is about learning to play the lute in the 17th century and in the 21st, and I, Dr. Sara Salloum, am your host. I'm a professional performing musician of Renaissance plucked string instruments and a music scholar interested in female musicians principally from England and from the Elizabethan and early Jacobean periods. After completing my doctorate last year, I offer my skills as an associate lecturer at Newcastle University, where I teach music history and demonstrate how performance practice can be used in research. I'm exceedingly fortunate today to be in conversation with the internationally renowned lutenist Jacob Heringman. Jacob first took up the lute in 1986 and has since performed with many diverse and international early music ensembles. He has an impressive discography and has played on many film and television soundtracks, including recordings for The Hobbit, and he arranged and performed the lute solo featured in Wolf Hall for BBC television. Jacob is also one of the finest lute teachers in the world, something which I can attest to, given he has been my very own lute tutor for 10 most meaningful years. So I thought I would start things off by talking through a little bit of a story of a particular lady who I researched very considerably as I pursued my PhD, and that is Margaret Bourd, who was born in 1600, and we don't know exactly when she started having her lute lessons, but she had a course of lute lessons, which seemed to be quite expensive ones. She seemed to be very, very dedicated to her lessons. And she did that throughout her childhood up until the point where she got married. The main reason we know about Margaret Bourd is because she produced what is now known as the Margaret Bourd Lute Book, or the GB London Royal Academy of Music manuscript 603, which contains not just her hand inside it, but the hands of multiple scribes. But she's the sort of main initial scribe who I think wrote about 105 pieces from the beginning of the book. Her name is written multiple times inside. She signed her name. Also, the leather-bound book is stamped with her initials, so we do know that there's a lot of markers of her ownership on this particular manuscript. The reason that we know about her, the reason that we can see so much detail about the kinds of pieces that she was learning and the level of education that she received. We know about a little bit about her family background and the place where she was likely born or maybe raised in the early years of her life, which was in Pax Hill, which is in West Sussex. She was of landed gentry status and was born into a large house and that kind of thing. You can get a sense of her social status, which for me actually is one of the initial things which I really see as a contrast. If you think about the kinds of people who were playing lutes then, and I don't know, you and me, for instance, we're not of landed gentry status, and I know there's a difference between amateur players and professional players, but even getting into the lute myself certainly didn't come from a background where huge amounts of money were being poured into me achieving this accomplishment. It was more like a more of a quirky interest, which you have to be quite brave to want to pursue, because it's not something that you see as necessarily acquiring you wealth. And things like instruments or things in relation to getting going with the lute are quite expensive. If you think back to your earliest days of getting into lute playing, but just thinking of particular challenges involved with getting your hands on instruments, grants or scholarships to be able to help you with that sort of a thing. It's such a huge contrast to the wealth that was sort of the money poured into getting young ladies or children in the 17th century to be learning, but the sort of barriers for us more unusual people who want to go and learn all about this and how they were overcome. I don't know if you can think of anything from your in history.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting one, because I think there are sort of two kinds of lute players now. You have the people who take it up at a relatively young age, although not young enough, I would say. Most of us have transitioned from the guitar, having played guitar for many years before that. And then the other kind of lute player is the sort that is never going to do it professionally, but does it for fun. And very often these people are retired people. I mean, in all of my teaching, the majority of my students are probably retired people. But for someone like me who started in my 20s and became a professional player, yeah, it's a kind of process of falling sideways, really, isn't it? You're on a particular track with your guitar or whatever, and you fall in love with this thing and sort of make your way from one track to another. It's like changing tracks,
Yes.
changing
Yes, and
tracks.
I think for both of us too, there was not a clear setup for how to pursue that once the interest had been sparked, or the knowledge of this instrument that we were becoming obsessed with, falling in love with,
Yeah,
was happening. There wasn't a clear trajectory of how to pursue that. It's very much one that gets put together along the way.
yeah.
Very
On,
much.
on this, yeah, this is a sidetrack in a sense, and therefore there are a lot of weeds growing on it, and you have to kind of
Mhm.
hack your way through them. You have to make it up as you go along, in a sense. And you were talking about obstacles to progress. Well,
Mhm.
yeah, the big one is getting hold of an instrument, and I was very lucky because there was a lecturer in music at the university where I was studying, and she sort of saw me playing the classical guitar, and she saw me playing a lot of lute music on the guitar, and she quietly bought a lute for the department,
Mhm.
hoping that I would pick it up, start playing it, and I did, and I've been playing it ever since. Not that same one, but
Mhm.
that's thanks to one generous and perceptive individual. Um, and I think you were lucky in that I believe the university had a lute already. Is that right? Were you able to use a university
Yes,
instrument, or did you
I
have
think
to?
actually I'm struggling to remember it was a university instrument for sure that actually Manchester University.
Yeah,
Even though I was studying at both the Conservatoire, the Royal Northern College of Music, and the University of Manchester, it was actually the university that acquired a lute first, I believe, and from the early music shop.
that's right.
Um,
Yeah,
and I cannot quite remember if that happened before I was making noises about being interested in the instrument and things like that, or if it was after. But I think it may have been before, or sort of the two things happened to coincide, but quite coincidentally. Yeah, and that really was a catalyst, as soon as you have a reasonable instrument in your hands. And then the second one for me being meeting you, it was I think I only in my second year of my undergraduate course when you visited again the university with Emma Kirkby to do a workshop, and then it was like a instrument was in my hands, and a very very inspiring player was I met in person, and got to hear you play, got to see your instruments, experience some of your tutoring, and I think also realized that I clicked with you in a way. I could see myself being in that world because of feeling a sense of kindred spirit with another person who was also interested in this particular thing.
yeah, yeah,
All of that seems in huge contrast to the experience of being a young lady learning the lute in the 17th century, where it really was like it was extremely advantageous for a young lady to learn the lute, and parents put a lot of pressure, and I get that impression because there's evidence that many ladies gave up the lute basically as soon as they were married, which indicates in a way that it was very much being done as a by parents pushing them to acquire every skillful accomplishment and marker of their status and excellence, and then as soon as the purpose for doing all of that was achieved, you could just cast it aside, and whereas in this day and age, being a young person wanting to do it, you really have to love it, I think, to want to
yeah,
pursue that, and quite at the mercy of I don't know, certain situations arising for you that catalyze things to move forward.
yeah. Hard for us to imagine, isn't it? I mean, the lute was mainstream in the sense that it was the done thing to do, to further your social status and so on, as you were just saying. And now it's such a niche activity that it's really for the independent-minded and the adventurous, which was
Hmm.
very much not the case then.
Yes,
And
yeah, you
so
were
it's
very
hard
much
for us.
putting
Yeah,
into a social category, like a recognizable activity that fits into a whole social setup. Yeah, you're quite right. The absolute opposite, very much individual personalities who would be driven to pursue such a thing today. I'm also just remembering something I think a fantastic point that you made about most of the amateur market for lute playing today tend to be of the older generation, and often I think it's would you agree with me in saying that often it's when people who have had an interest in the lute have the time to take lessons, perhaps the money as well to have one-to-one lessons. It tends to happen in their retirement. So often, I suppose, waiting for that freedom means that they're, of an older age. That is a huge contrast to people in the 17th century where it was mostly children, the lute playing,
Yeah, yeah,
acquiring skills and instruments was something that was very much associated with the experience of childhood, with the activities of childhood. I'm just prompted to mention something again from the Margaret Board Luke book because I'm remembering her signature when she it appears as though she played the lute up until the point when she was married. And we can tell that because she sort of signs off at the end of her layer of the lute book, the last piece that she's copied in, she signs, and thus I end my play, and then Margaret Bourne, which was her married name. But very interestingly, the word that she uses for play is not really the one that you would use for playing in the context of playing musical instruments, but it's the kind of word that you would use for playing with toys or, a childhood like play. So that indicates in a way there's a bit of evidence for the fact that it was associated with childhood activities and less a thing for to enter into the adult world or
yeah. It's
um
a sort of there's sort of a veiled reference to the that a biblical reference to putting away childish things, you know.
mhm. What's being gotten at here is it's like, yeah, now I must put away these these bits and pieces from that belong in the realm of childhood
Yeah,
as I enter into the next stage. That
yeah,
in a way that couldn't be more contrast with
yeah,
now because it's it's so difficult actually to like I can only think of two instances where I've seen the lute like performances on the lute and children come together. It's very difficult to enter into settings or occasions where you can get children to engage with the lute because it's now very niche. Many people don't even know about the instrument. It's not part of it doesn't there's no ABRSM exam board for
no,
lute or
yeah.
Trinity, these kinds of things. Really at this stage at least.
It's
It's
it's another really good example of polar opposites going on because, you know, she put away her childish play when she got married. Nowadays, I have half of my students coming to me and saying, "I've just retired. Now I can start playing." You know,
yes.
it's exactly the opposite. Very often it's because they suddenly have the means to buy instruments or they suddenly have the time. Just today, I was teaching somebody who is makes his living as a violin teacher.
Hmm.
He's in America. I was teaching him online, and he is doing a bit less teaching now. And he said that he's dreamed of taking up the lute since he was 15, and he wishes he had started earlier. And I have a dream of getting more children to play. I think the repertoire is really demanding.
Hmm.
And when you think about it, you know, an accomplished violinist or pianist will have been playing since early childhood. And we take it up as adults usually, and it's not really fair. If
Hmm.
we want to do proper justice to the music, we should be doing it from childhood because it's as demanding as any music I know, you know.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and I've played all sorts of music, and you have. So I do have this dream of getting more children to start playing younger. And but also it's wonderful that there are old people who have the means and the time to tackle the lute.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
I mean, lockdown was the other interesting phenomenon during the COVID era because um, I was pretty much flooded with people who wanted lute lessons because they needed a lockdown project. And people bought a lot of lutes from places like the Early Music Shop and took up the lute during lockdown. Some of them are still playing. I have a feeling there was a bit of probably a bit of a large number of secondhand lutes suddenly available 3 or 4 years
Oh, I bet. Yeah.
after all,
Yes. It
because
like
you know,
there was a
not,
boom and then.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Not everyone's going to stick with it, but well, whatever makes people play, you know.
Yes, that's true. That's true. This made me think of a couple of things. I have a couple of students of my own now, actually. Um, one person who was very, very keen to take up the lute now as an older person because of the complexity of everything involved in learning the instrument. It's almost like the challenge of doing a 4D puzzle or a 5D puzzle, is figuring out tablature and getting the hands to work in coordination with each other, and seeing that as a really healthy activity to do, healthy for the brain, which I can also relate to things I've read from the Burrell lute tutor, for instance,
Yeah.
talking about how like your faculties will remain um, in good health or strong, and even physical things, because of playing the lute. Like that I've sort of seen that idea come out even in somebody engaging with lute pedagogy today, that sense of it being healthy, the challenge is healthy for you. And I don't know, our students seem to be aware of these aspects even when they're coming at a later stage.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah, and
interesting.
that makes me think again about the reasons for learning the lute if you're a young lady of a certain social status in the 17th century. It develops all kinds of aspects of the person, doesn't it? I
Mm,
mean, think about just the coordination. I have students who are suddenly facing the challenge of working, doing this stuff with the fingers, total independence of fingers, how to hold down voices while moving other fingers and so on. That we take it sort of for granted, we players, but actually, those are really fine motor skills, and all
mm,
of that stuff is training the person in a form of refinement, isn't it?
yes.
I think of a student I used to teach who is a consultant neurologist,
Mm,
and she was utterly fascinated. She didn't play any instrument. This was all new to her. But teaching her was fascinating because she was utterly amazed by the things that we have to do with our fingers. And she, of course, was seeing it with her neurologist's brain and thinking about which nerve endings were being fired and you know, which bit of the brain was triggering this independent movement of the different fingers. She would say, "Oh, you should come and talk to my students at the medical school and demonstrate what you do with your fingers, and I can use this as an illustration of the complexities of the brain." And it made me think, this
yeah.
is teaching refinement of a very
Yes.
particular sort.
Yes, I think that also highlights to me how much that scientific side of it, like we're not really ever thinking of when we're practicing. That's quite fascinating to have somebody be able to perceive that side of it. But absolutely, that there's so much fine skill, refined skill involved, and to be able to produce that or to perform these fine skills in a way that also is graceful or very
Yeah,
efficient or
yeah,
visually appealing. That was a huge part of playing the lute in the 17th century, as a way of demonstrating your poise and your
yeah,
gracefulness, meaning that you're mastering that fine dexterity very, very successfully.
yeah, yeah. You and I know, but maybe listeners might not know that the 16th and 17th century treatises are full of references to grace and graceful bearing
Yes.
and easy gracefulness and there was clearly an emphasis on poise.
Yes.
And if a player was sort of hunched over the instrument, they'd be compared to like a monkey or a demon or something.
Hmm.
It's
Yes.
it's so much part of the training of grace and elegance
Yes,
and
yes, I can
poise.
think even also of lute tutor books, printed tutors from the period. If they describe how you should hold your lute, they always talk about the way that you're sitting first, to be sitting
Yeah,
upright, even
yeah,
before they mention how you're holding the instrument. That it should always come from sort of holding your body in a in a charming or a handsome way. That's at the core of
yeah,
every movement that you're making when you're playing the lute. It's really like a way of fashioning yourself to the public, and showing
yeah.
your abilities.
Totally. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but in period films, very often they get all the costumes right, they get everything right, except that the actors have not been coached at all in grace and poise, and they look like 21st century people. They look sort of slumped and hunched, and
Mhm.
and you know that people of that particular social status that's being portrayed in the film
Yes.
would never be seen like that. And often that's the one thing that where a period film falls down because it just looks wrong.
Yes, yeah, I think it's something I can imagine a context in which that kind of hunched over your instrument posture makes sense, and that's thinking a very sort of romantic way of playing where your emotions are really on the surface and gestures are all in conjuring up a sense of you being lost in a way in the rapture of what you're performing. It's almost like that is coming into an early modern performance context, and it doesn't work at all. That's like the tutors talk about, that you should have a smiling countenance, but not anything that's too extraneously, not too much extraneous movement or large gestures that would seem, I suppose, distasteful, or nothing should ever look as if it's very difficult as well. That sense of virtuosity, meaning really that it should look nonchalant when you're playing
Yeah.
something. So a too self-indulgent way of embracing the instrument or expressing any sorts of musical gestures is really just from a much later period.
Totally. The aim is to make it look easy.
Yes.
To make it look easy. If it looks difficult, if it looks like there's a great deal of that's sort of post-romantic approach, isn't it? It's that thing of climbing a mountain with your music. You have to, difficult or not, you have to make it look easy. I
Yes.
think if you
Yeah.
want to look the part.
Look the
And of
period.
course, that's also mechanical efficiency, because it's a difficult task playing, and if you do extraneous stuff, it's just going to hinder you doing what you are capable of doing,
Yes.
really.
Yes. Thank you so much for listening today. If you'd like to learn more about the early music at Newcastle Festival, or about my own lute research and performance work, you can follow the links and search terms displayed on screen now. We hope to see you at our next event.